Hello everyone. I'm hoping you're having a good day, good evening, good night, wherever you are. And welcome back to my third episode of True Paranormal Stories. And tonight I'm going to talk about one of my favorite places that I really one day want to go. It's called the Skinwalker Ranch, and it's located in Utah. And actually it's in a really remote rural corner of the state of Utah in the United States. And the family that lived there believed that the ranch was occupied by some sort of intelligence that controlled their thoughts and their physical reality and their perception of things around them. And the ranch is considered to be cursed by the Native Americans that live in that area and considered off limits for tribe members. And the Native Americans take this land, this cursed land, very seriously. They will not go on it. And they won't set a foot on this land, even to this day. They won't do it. And it's been like that for centuries. And there's been thousands of UFO sightings reported in the area. Now, these people, when they first bought the property, they lived in Texas and they wanted to move to a remote area away from people and raise prize cattle. So they picked this ranch because it was really remote, had a lot of water, ponds, a little lake, and it was already fenced, and it was beautiful pastures. And so they thought this would be the perfect place. So they bought the property from what they'd seen in pictures, sight unseen. And there's two houses on the property. In the main ranch house, this is their observation when they first entered the house. Upon first entering their house, they found every door had several large, heavy-duty bolts, deadbolts, and it was bolted on the inside and the outside. All of the windows were bolted. At each end of the farmhouse, large metal chains were attached to the building with huge steel rings. And they were embedded securely into each end of the house, into the wall. The previous owners had apparently chained very large guard dogs on both ends of the house. The windows had been barred and deadbolts were on both sides of each door, even the doors on the inside. And the new owners thought, what on earth were these people, the previous owners, afraid of to go to that much trouble? Excuse me. So they moved into the house, and they just thought it was somebody being overly cautious, which they should have been. And I want to relate one story. Shortly after they moved in, they started having paranormal issues and seeing things on the property and things that they just could not explain. I'm really having trouble talking tonight, excuse me. So here's a chapter out of the book, and here's the book. It's called Hunt for the Skinwalker, and it is by Coam A. Kelleher, PhD, and George Knapp. Now, George Knapp is a investigator for a TV station in Las Vegas, and he does a lot of paranormal investigation and stuff, and he's well versed on some of these things. He actually spent time at this ranch, and that's a true story. But here's a chapter out of the book, and it's called The Wolf. And this is where the family is standing just outside their home, and this happened. So here we go. What is that, Tom Gorman? wondered as he looked across the field at the distant animal loping in his direction. He paused briefly and put down the heavy box he had lifted off the truck. Tom, his son, had the perfect... Oh, no, I'm sorry. Tom Gorman was the father. Gosh, I'm having an awful time. Sorry. Tom had the perfect eyesight of a trained marksman, and he knew from half a mile away that this animal was big. The approaching shape was much too big for a coyote. His wife Ellen joined him, an unspoken question in her eyes. Tom briefly nodded his head in the direction of the animal, and she began to look puzzled. The thing was about 400 yards away, and the closer it got, the bigger it looked. "Wolf?" murmured Ellen. Ed Gorman, Tom's father, joined them. The beast was gray, and even from 300 yards they could see that its pelt was wet from running through the wet grass. The animal loped gracefully in a series of S-turns and stopped about 50 yards from the family. This was a very bizarre behavior for a wolf. But this wolf was almost 3 times as big as any Tom had ever seen. It gazed peacefully at the family. Ellen shifted uneasily and glanced around to see where her 2 children were. Both were standing in silence at the top of the flatbed truck, looking right at the wolf. "Maybe it's somebody's pet," ventured Ed. The animal began walking casually toward the family, unconcerned, but obviously determined to make some kind of contact. It appeared completely tame. Tom glanced at the corral 70 feet to his right, where he had just unloaded several of his prize Angus calves. They were the first of his herd to be on the property, and briefly he wondered about the wisdom of bringing them onto the land. One calf, more curious than the rest, stood with its head through the bars of the corral, looking directly at the wolf that was now only 100 feet away. The other animals were at the back of the corral, and they shifted nervously at the strong scent in the air. From 10 feet away, the smell of rain on dog pelt filled the air as the animal trotted peacefully up to Ed Gorman. Ed, like his son, stood over 6 feet tall, and the wolf reached almost to his chest. Massive muscles rippled beneath its shiny gray-silver coat. The eyes were a shocking shade of light blue that penetrated the soul. Ed reached down and petted the huge beast as it stood looking at the family. Tom felt a tightening in his gut. Something was not quite right. Even somebody's pet wolf would not be this completely tame. A 200-pound wolf exuding a zen-like calm, something didn't compute. The animal walked nonchalantly around in front of the family, and Emily and Ed began to relax. Ellen turned around and yelled to the kids to come over. I don't think I would have done that. Tad and Kate Gorman jumped from the flatbed and ran over. The family began talking all at once, and Tad suggested they try to keep the wolf as a pet. Too late, they saw the swift, graceful bound that took the wolf to the bars of the corral. With unbelievable speed, the young calf's head was trapped in the animal's powerful jaws. The movement had been lightning fast, and the family stood paralyzed with fear. The 300-pound calf bleated pitifully as the wolf tried to drag it through the bars of the corral. Tom sprang into action, ran across, and landed 2 powerful kicks into the ribs of the wolf. Ed followed and grabbed a stout baseball bat he had just unloaded. With all of his considerable strength, Ed beat at the wolf's back as it braced against the bars of the corral, trying to drag the hapless calf through it. The bleats were getting more urgent as the vice-like lock on the calf's snout tightened. "Get my magnum," Tom barked as he aimed more kicks at the wolf's ribs. even as the sickening thud of Tom's heavy boots rained into the animal's abdomen. The beast seemed totally unconcerned. Tad ran to the flatbed, retrieved a powerful handgun, and quickly delivered it to his father. Gorman took aim and squeezed the trigger. The shot ran out across the field and slammed into the wolf's ribs. The slug from the .357 had no effect whatsoever on the attacking animal. It didn't yelp, it didn't pause, and more notably, it didn't bleed. Quickly, Tom pumped 2 more shots into the wolf's upper abdomen. On the 3rd shot, the wolf slowly and reluctantly released the bleeding calf. The calf scampered quickly to the back of the corral and, still bleating, lay down. It was bleeding heavily from the head. The huge beast stood about 10 feet away from Tom, but displayed no signs of discomfort. Tom couldn't believe it. 3 shots from a magnum should have killed the animal or at least badly injured it. Not a sound came from the wolf as it gazed unconcernedly at Gorman. Gorman raised the magnum again and, aimed carefully, shot the animal near the heart. It backed off maybe 30 feet, still facing the family, and still showed no signs of distress. A chill crept over Tom, and the family drew closer together. They were all more than familiar with the power of the Colt Magnum. They had seen firsthand the devastation it causes. Yet this wolf was not even making a sound after being shot 4 times at point-blank range with a .357 Magnum. There were no signs of blood on the beast. It seemed peaceful, but glanced back at the calf in the corral, as if pondering the wisdom of another attack. "Get the .30-06, Tom said, never taking his eyes off the huge beast. Tad ran to the homestead and returned in seconds, bearing the heavy firearm. Tom had killed dozens of elk from over 200 yards with this weapon. As he took aim at the wolf a mere 40 feet away, he momentarily felt pity for the beast. The thunderous shot rang out. The sound of the bullet hitting flesh and bone near the shoulder was unmistakable. The wolf recoiled, but stood calmly looking at Tom. His mouth went dry. He felt a cold sweat running down his back, and Ellen began to cry. Ed began to curse softly under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. The wolf should be silent, bleeding in a pile of dead flesh. Instead, it recoiled, backed off maybe 10 feet, but still seemed perfectly healthy. Tom took a deep breath and raised the weapon again, aiming for the huge chest cavity. The bullet ripped through the animal, and a sizable chunk of flesh detached from the exit wound and lay on the grass. Still the wolf made no sound. Then, with a last unhurried look at the stunned family, the wolf turned slowly and began to trot away across the grass. Tears of fear streamed down Ellen's face as she hugged her 12-year-old daughter. Tom's face was white, and there was strain in his voice as he turned toward his family. "Let's keep calm," he muttered hoarsely, but didn't sound very convincing. "I'm going after it." The animal was now almost 100 yards away, trotting west across the field in the direction of a dense group of cottonwoods. Beyond the cottonwoods lay a roaring creek. Tad grabbed the magnum and Tom hefted the .30-aught, and the family watched as they sprinted off in the same direction as the wolf. The animal was only trotting, but covering ground quickly. Anger and fear pulsed through Tom as he pushed himself to run quicker. He was already out of breath, but they were gaining on the wolf. They could see the animal disappearing into the belt of cottonwoods and then reappear in the open ground beyond. It stopped momentarily, shaking itself free of the moisture from the grass before heading for the creek. Tad ran silently, feeling how upset his father was, but concentrating on keeping the wolf in his sight. The wolf seemed to be accelerating. It was now almost 300 yards ahead of them and still loping easily as it reached a denser patch of Russian olive trees that bordered the creek. As they ran, Tom noticed that the tracks of the animal were easily visible in the wet ground. Gorman was an experienced tracker, and he was confident they could track the animal even in the thick Russian olives. His sharp eyes spotted the silvery gray blur as the animal disappeared into the tree line. Minutes later, Tom and Tad ran into the tree line, following the giant animal's tracks. In some places, it had left inch-deep impressions in the soft ground. There was no evidence of blood on or between the huge footprints, so he wasn't bleeding. Tom couldn't shake the fear as he brushed through the tightly woven undergrowth. His pace had slowed because the large trees were interwoven with thorny brambles and weeds. The tracks were still visible. As they approached the creek, they could hear the water gurgling as it cascaded merrily over the rocks. They broke cover near the bank of the creek, and Tom held up his hand. Tad stopped, and the two listened carefully. They heard no sound of an animal crashing through the undergrowth. The huge paw marks periodically meandered in and out of the surrounding vegetation, but consistently shadowed the direction of the creek. Tom guessed they had run at least a mile at this point. Several minutes later, the two broke through into the open, about 40 yards from the river. They breathed a sigh of relief. It was hard going stumbling through the trees, making sure the head-high thorns and brushes didn't take a toll on their skin and their faces. Suddenly, Tom stopped breathing. He grabbed Tad's arm and pointed. The wolf tracks were directly in front of them, as plain as day, as they headed toward the creek. About 25 yards from the river, the prints entered a muddy patch, and it appeared as if the 200-pound animal had sunk almost 2 inches in the mud. The deep paw prints continued for another 5 yards and then stopped. The tracks simply vanished. So did the wolf. Gone. There was no possibility that the animal had leaped the intervening 6 feet to land in the river. The tracks just stopped abruptly. The Gormans walked slowly and carefully, looking at the perfectly formed tracks in the thick mud and trying to see any change that might explain the sudden disappearance. Around where the tracks halted, the ground appeared about as soft as the mud patch. It was as if the animal had vanished into thin air. Tom looked at his son, and he could see that the teenager was white-faced and trembling and close to tears. Tom felt stunned. He couldn't reassure his son because he just didn't have an explanation. All he could say was, "We'd best be getting back. It's near sundown." Tad nodded dumbly, fighting to keep his father from seeing how scared he was. They were silent as they trudged the miles back to the homestead. Thoughts raced through Tom's head. The family had just moved to get away from the busybodies in the closed community that kept prying into their lives. They had looked in Utah because property prices were right. In this out-of-the-way place tucked away in northeast Utah, they had found their dream property. The elderly previous owners had virtually abandoned it. They were a prosperous family who now resided in Salt Lake City, and they visited their property a couple of times a year to make sure the fence lines were intact, but they wouldn't live there. They were willing to unload the property to the Gormans at a very fair price. I'm sure they did. I'd want to get rid of it too. The family knew that about a year of hard work would be required to fix it up. High ridges bound acreage to the north, and the flowing creek to the south, and extensive fencing to the west. As they trudged through the deep undergrowth, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Had they made a mistake in buying this place? Thoughts tumbled through his mind, causing his gut to tighten even more. He knew something had happened today that everyone knew was physically impossible, and it had occurred in daylight and in full view. Quickly, Tom came to his decision as he stood facing his family. He was not going to second-guess their decision to move. "Look, son," he said to Tad, "I can't explain what happened, and I'm not even going to try. Let's just forget that this happened and go have a meal in town." Tad just grinned weakly, relieved at last that his father was taking charge. And that's one of the stories in the book when they first moved there. So if you want to read, this book is a good read. It is a true story, and the property was bought by a company in Las Vegas. This man hired several, let me see here. He hired several scientists, physical, scientific, paranormal people. He just ran a whole gamut of whatever credible scientists that he could get together as a team. And let's see what he called it. And the name of it is NIDS, but I was trying to get the name of the company. But anyway, it's the company is NIDS, and it's a company that bought the ranch from the Gormans just to do their own paranormal studies and physical studies, and they did gather a huge amount of evidence to prove that something was going on there, not necessarily ghosts or things like that, but it was more of a UFO type of evidence, perhaps interdimensional type beings that were coming through, like this wolf, and they would chase these things and chase them into the woods, and then the tracks would just end and they're gone. He lost 2 good hunting dogs that were chasing a wolf that ran into the thicket, and when he chased after them, he heard the dogs yowl in pain, and when he got up to where he thought they were, it looked like there was a scuffle and then nothing. It's like the tracks there was no tracks, nothing. It's like the dogs had just ran through a portal or something and just disappeared. And these are his first-hand accounts, and not only his, but other people who had lived on the ranch as well. I mean, this had been going on for centuries. And so NIDS, NIDS, based out of Las Vegas, and Colm, C-O-L-M, Colliher, Ph.D., is the one who is in charge of the research. So they set up a base. They bought the land from the Gormans just in order to study this. It's still fenced. It's still patrolled, and no one is allowed in there. And whatever they're finding, they're not sharing with the public, but they are sharing it with the military. That's interesting that the U.S. military had become involved in this. So there's got to be something to it going on over there. But it's almost like an Area 51 to try to get into it. And a lot of people have tried. A lot of YouTubers have tried to get in, and you can't. But my son and I would like to at least drive up there and see it. But it is quite a costly trip as far as the length of time, the money for fuel and food and lodging, and we're just not in a position to do that right now, but maybe one day. And some of the other things that happened was, what was that? I had a list of things here. Gosh, I'm just really organized tonight, aren't I? The family had seen, and the researchers had saw large oblong dish shapes that slowly cruise over the pastures. In 1994-95, cattle began to suddenly disappear, never to be seen again, or they would find cattle that was mutilated, and when they were, the scientists checked the animals, there were organs missing from the animals, and then the animals were just, what was left was left. But they said that they were surgical incisions with a sharp instrument. They were not animal attacks. They said someone had deliberately done surgery on these animals. The family saw brilliant blue orbs that would menace them whenever they go out and walk the pasture, or even sitting on their porch. These bright blue orbs would fly right at them like they're going to hit them and veer off right at the last second. Of course, you know about large wolf creatures seen in the woods. The wolf creatures, the Native Americans around that area call them skinwalkers. And if you want to know what a skinwalker is, they're evil people that can turn themselves into various animals. Wolves seem to be a favorite, birds. And they are evil people, evil medicine men or evil shamans, whatever, who can actually do this. And they've talked about this for centuries. It's in Native American folklore from way back. And not just this one tribe, but several. In 1996, the media began getting reports of the strange activity. So things were going on and the people tried to keep it quiet, but you know how that goes. All you have to do is tell one person, it ends up in the media. In September 1996, here we go, an organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science, that is NIDS, N-I-D-S, bought the property, and never before had a scientific organization been created and funded, in part by the government, to bring scientific rigor to what was essentially paranormal activity. And some of their bizarre experiences and data is published, but research is still going on, and the property is most definitely off limits to the public, except for a few who have managed to sneak onto the property and were quite shocked by things that they have seen and refused to talk about some of them. It was so shocking. Or the military caught them and escorted them off. So that's the hunt for the skinwalker. I would love to get up here on that property, and those kind of things don't really scare me, but I'm more curious than I would be afraid. So I definitely want to make a trip up there one day, and I will one day, as soon as I can get some money together. You guys all know how that is. So I will end this by telling you my story, since we're talking about animals. I grew up in Ohio, in northern Ohio actually, up close to Lake Erie. And we lived in an area that you would have like a house and then a large area of woods, thick, dense trees, and then a house and then another area of thick, dense trees. And the properties were we had 3 acres of just yard, just grass and trees and shrubbery and, that's a lot of grass. So, but the grass abruptly ended right on a tree line. So, and our house was almost like in the center of the property. And we had a really long driveway. So, and of course, us being little kids, I moved there when we were 6. I was 6 and my sister was 4. And of course, we're going to play in the woods like all kids. I mean, it's right there. And we had swing sets and stuff that were like on the edge of the woods and that kind of thing. But I always felt like we were watched when we were in the woods, and it was just a really creepy feeling. But at night, I felt like something followed me around all the time. And I would told my parents about it, and they said, "Oh, it's just your imagination, little kid." But they were not big on discussing anything, which I had made a point when, if my children experienced anything, I always made a point to want to talk to them about it and, see what was going on and what was happening. And my parents are just the opposite. We weren't allowed to talk about anything. So, and anything that we did bring up was quickly dismissed. So my bedroom window, well, I should tell you first that there was a tiny little house there. It was almost like a cabin with a living room, a small kitchen, and one bedroom. And they bought this property. Well, they kept the main house that was there and remodeled onto it, or built onto it. They added a wing of bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, because it didn't even have a bathroom when we moved in there. We had to walk like 100 yards out the back of the house to a outhouse. And so that was pretty inconvenient, especially in the winter because Ohio gets a lot of snow. But so they remodeled the house and had all this new part onto it and everything. There was a basement that continually flooded, so they had that filled in. So we didn't have a basement anymore. And there were some outbuildings on the property, but this property was like ancient. The house was so old, and the buildings on the property were so old. But anyway, I felt like I was being watched all the time. And in the woods, right on the tree line in the woods at night, I would see this, and I'd be so scared to go to sleep. I'd always talk my sister into coming in and sleeping with me, even though we had our own rooms because I was afraid to be in there alone. But in the tree line, right across from my bedroom window, and there was probably about 150 yards from my window to the woods, and I could see something that looked like about 7 or 8 feet tall. It was huge. Had glowing red eyes, and it was just a black silhouette is all I could see of it. And it was just like, it stood up tall like humanoid and just standing there with its arms down to its side. And all I could see was a black silhouette of this tall, huge thing, and it was real hairy. You could see that it was like covered in fur. And it would just stand there and just stare at the house. And I noticed that shortly after the remodel was all done. And I looked out and it scared me to death, of course, you can imagine. And so by that time I was about 7 or 8, and I'd seen it many times. But I tried to ignore it. How typical kid, you get in bed and pull the covers over your head and it's not there, right? If you don't see it, it's not there. And I would hear something walking outside. I had 2 windows in my bedroom on the ground floor. And I could hear something walking around the bedroom windows like I was trying to look in. And so a couple of times I got so frightened that I would yell for my parents, and they would come, turn on the light, and they would look outside. My dad would go outside and walk around the house and, that kind of thing, and never found anything or substantiated anything. But I would see it all the time, and it just scared me to death. And so one night, they decided to move bedrooms. So my parents, my sister had a large bedroom. And so my parents took my room and put my sister in another room. And I ended up there were like 3 bedrooms in a row. And I ended up and our house was in like an L shape. So I ended up in the bedroom in the L, facing into the L. And my mother had turned that into like a big garden area and, flower gardens and stuff. It was really pretty. So one night I was trying to go to sleep, and in the distance in the woods, I could hear dogs barking, like, big dogs. And they were barking and barking and barking, and I could hear them getting closer and closer and closer. And I'm just laying there petrified, and I didn't want to look out the window because I didn't want to see what was going on. And pretty soon I heard them coming out of the woods across our property toward the house. And I mean, it sounded like a pack of dogs. And they were just, whatever they were chasing, they were really aggressive, growling and barking. I mean, the mean barks. So whatever they were chasing, it was huge. It ran up into the L, where the house was in L shape, through my mom's garden. And the darn thing backed up against my bedroom window. Why it picked on me, I don't know. But backed up against my bedroom window, and it was doing this, throwing its arms, kind of flailing at these dogs that were attacking it. And I mean, and it was growling. I mean, it was like this really booming, deep guttural growl, and the dogs were barking. I mean, it was a lot of noise. So it scared me to death. And so I jumped out of bed. I ran down the hallway to my parents' room. And I ran in their room, and I jumped on their bed, and I said, "There's something in my window. Can't you hear it? Can't you hear it?" And my parents were just laying like stiff in bed, like they didn't want to know what it was. I mean, they were just laying there, and they said, "There's nothing there. You're going to have to go back to sleep." And I said, "You are not going to send me back in that bedroom." And they said, "You go to your room and go back to sleep. It's nothing. You were dreaming." And all the time they're talking to me, I'm hearing this, right? And I know they heard it because I could see by the look on their face that they heard it. So, and I could not understand why they wanted me to go back to bed in that room with that thing there, outside against the window. And it didn't last a real long time, but it lasted long enough that I went out and I crouched in the hallway, in the middle of the hallway. Well, not in the middle, up against the wall. And I crouched there and slept there for the rest of the night because I was not going back in that room. The noise subsided because you could hear, evidently it had ran back into the woods and the dogs were chasing it. And you could hear the dogs getting further and further and further away. All I knew is that it was big, and it was dark black, and it was hairy, like whole body hairy, even the head. And I didn't know if it was a bear, if it was whatever that thing was that was watching the house, or I just didn't know, but it was gone. And I saw that thing in the woods at night, every night, for almost the whole time that we lived there, which is most of my childhood. And then my parents one day, of course, that was back in the 50s, and they didn't discuss things with the kids. You just went along with whatever they did. They just came in one day and said, "We've sold the house. We're going to move to California." I mean, from one eastern part of the country, clear across the whole country, to about as far as you could get to California. And I never did get a good explanation as to why we left or why we had to go that far. But that's what they did. They uprooted us and brought us out to California, and I hated the whole thing. But anyway, that's the way it goes. But that's my story. And that happened when I was a child. And of course, we moved from a country setting into a city setting in California. So there was no woods or anything around us. And I don't know if that had anything to do with us moving that far away and into a city rather than a country setting, because it was a beautiful property where we were at. I mean, we had a beautiful home and gorgeous property. I mean, it was just beautiful. And then for them to just go, "Okay, that's enough, we're leaving." And I'm wondering if that had something to do with it. So anyway, that was my childhood paranormal story, and I still to this day don't know what that was about. So, but I'm just glad that it doesn't happen anymore. So I move out in the middle of the desert, and now we got a whole new set of things out here, which is pretty much explainable for the most part. I still don't like going out at night because I worry more about animals now. I don't worry about the paranormal, but I do worry about animals. So that's my story for tonight. I hope I didn't run too long and bore everybody to death. But you guys have a good night, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you so much for listening if you got this far. And you have a great day and a great week. And we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.